Well, it would seem I'm back with Hollow Knight, and with the Y Defender.
Yup.
Yeah, hello to you too, Ogre. After the lore and the NPCs, it's time for the pièce de résistance. For this second video dedicated to Hollow Knight, I'm going to tackle the sublime soundtrack composed by Australian composer Christopher Larkin, who was also in charge of the sound design.
Yorama!
And he did great. Before diving into Hollow Knight's soundtrack, I'd like to mention a few other works by Christopher Larkin that I particularly like. The soundtrack to Expand, really haunting with its fascinating build-ups and releases, especially in the last tracks, and the two short pieces called Monochrome Modulation 1 and 2. It would seem I can't get enough of them. Also, that is some decent cable pull. Okay, let me add a third one, the soundtrack to puzzle game Touhou. The very detailed work on orchestration is absolutely exquisite. It's just a shame that the sound design, although lovely, sometimes completely overwhelms the music. Lost, for instance, we almost can't hear it in the game, so it's one more reason to have a good listen to the soundtrack. And I'd like to mention Papercorn Babycorn Unicorn, a short animated film made by Makoto Koji, also known as Paper Rabbits, which is just the cutest thing. And guess who wrote the music for it? That being said, be prepared. I love music, I love Hollow Knight, so it's going to take a while. 2 hours, precisely. Hollow Knight's music was composed with Cubase. Therefore, it's not directly played by live musicians, but it essentially features, except for the viola, the voice, and, I assume, the piano, virtual instruments, that is to say, musical libraries containing a large quantity of samples, with in general all the attacks, bow strokes, vibratos, effects that you wish, depending on the instruments, and there is a plethora of them. For example, you can buy yourself the virtual sound of Joshua Bell, since Ambertone has the Joshua Bell violin library with several gigabytes of samples by the American violinists, without the giant choreography. Sorry, Mr. Bell. This can, depending on which libraries you use, result in sounds and phrasings that aren't always the most faithful. My little flutists' heart tightens when I hear my instrument in Green Path. Sorry, I'm being a bit picky here, but this is an interesting choice because of how rich the counterpoint is in Hollow Knight's music. The sounds blend together, blurring the individual tones, thus allowing for a crystal clear counterpoint. This reminds me of a technique I had studied a bit in chamber music at the conservatory. Some of the teachers were members of a famous string quartet, the Danel Quartet, and one of their ideas regarding sound was that in an ensemble, if we all play with a beautiful sound at the same time, the result will lack clarity, and sometimes a pyramidal sound distribution was preferred. They had illustrated this with a string quartet, which they had asked to play first with a very beautiful sound for everyone. We didn't understand anything about the excerpt's polyphony. Then they played the same excerpt, this time with a beautiful sound for the first violin, less for the second violin, even less for the viola, up to the cello, which had to play with a very concentrated sound, shall we say. Alone it was hideous, but the result when they played together was very beautiful. The polyphony was absolutely clear, and you couldn't hear that the cello had an unpleasant tone. I experienced it firsthand with the flute cello harp ensemble. The teacher asked the cellist and me to play with a similar intention, but not too pretty a sound, which allowed the harp to be heard effortlessly and gave her more freedom. That's exactly what happens here. Sounds taken separately aren't always beautiful, it has to be said. Again, I'm being quite picky. But when put together, they blend wonderfully and the counterpoint is almost unbelievably clear. And I must confess that I am a musician who is very sensitive to counterpoint. Also, the various motifs and tones are so appropriate that nothing ever sounds out of place, and especially the phrases really breathe. However, we can lose part of the phrasing and tone quality, but for melodies that require extra attention to phrasing, they are played by live instruments, Amelia Jones's wonderful voice and Tim Chill's dark but sweet viola. Silksong's soundtrack will apparently feature more live instruments. 5 excerpts have been heard, 2 trailer musics, 1 boss theme, Lace, Lucky Lace, 1 aria theme, Bon Bottom, and the menu loop, and all of them seriously make my mouth water. Sorry about that. The Dies Irae seems to be quite involved. Well, technically, other musics were heard in the gameplay reveal at the Nintendo Treehouse during the 2019 E3, but those ones weren't released as a preview. We'll wait. Another thing is that in most areas of the game, the music is divided into 3 layers, sometimes more, sometimes less, but it's mostly 3 layers. And each one of them already includes several instruments. There's the main part with the melody. The accompaniment, called the bass layer. And the action layer, a more dynamic, sometimes even spectacular element, only triggered during a more difficult platforming sequence or in an inescapable room with either several waves of enemies or a single, more valiant enemy. This means we can have a room with just the main layer, then another one with 2 layers, then 2 others, or even 3 layers together. This almost gives the impression that there never are 2 rooms with the same music, while illustrating the non-linear navigation in the game. We have a lot of exploration possibility from the beginning, since the evolution of the music from one room to another is precisely non-linear too. This three-layer method, in addition to improving the usual loop technique, when the area's music is finished, it starts again, also allows for great fluidity in the transitions between different rooms and areas. For example, when we arrive in the Mantis village, a sub-area at the bottom of Fungal Wastes, the bass layer changes to illustrate the different character of the enemies we face there. We'll come back to this effect later since it has a narrative origin. Also, when coming from Greenpath to the Fungal Wastes, we explore Fog Canyon for a while, whose music consists in elements from Greenpath's score, with a muffled effect since we're actually above an acid lake. To add complexity while keeping transparency, a last layer is sometimes added, a very discrete atmosphere, with some sounds and noises from both the enemies and the environment. Sometimes there is no music, just this atmosphere layer. Hello, Deepness. Because of this, the music in the soundtrack is a little different from what you hear in the game. The music of some areas is reconstructed from the different layers available. Great attention is also paid to the acoustics. You know how I always talk about acoustics. It's my thing. Depending on the room's nature, there will be quite a lot of reverberation, or on the contrary, the acoustics will be rather dry. This applies to both the game's music and sounds, since it's something that can be controlled in Unity, the game engine used to make Hollow Knight. What makes it really special in this game is that this is really spectacular. It sounds like each room has its own acoustics depending on the materials, the size, if it's an open-air area or a small enclosed space.
Pantera? Cattereo! Oh!
Sometimes you can even hear two different acoustics at the same time. In the royal waterways, when you sit on the bench, you hear the water drops from the bench room with dry acoustics, and the water drops from another room, larger, with more reverb. That's nice. But even without this, the music manages by itself to translate the imposing dimensions of the kingdom, the depth of the rooms. In Green Path's music, which I used as an example earlier for the different layers, we can quickly hear a harp ostinato in the bass part, in fact doubled, since we hear this same pattern shifted by half a beat, softer, illustrating the dimensions of this beautiful aria like a natural echo, in addition to almost creating a resulting pattern effect for the attentive ears. In Fungal Wastes, an equally vast area and with a rather vertical navigation, since it's here that we get the Mantis Claw for a much-awaited wall jump, whereas Green Path expands rather horizontally, the music uses repeated notes and rhythms that seem to be directly reflected in the cave, like Green Path's rooms or Crystal Peak's mine. In addition to the outright fascinating treatment of the different sound planes and how the reverberation is managed to suggest the dimensions of this area. Like here, it sounds like a hyper-reverberated flute tremolo, as if it were played 3 rooms away. To me, it's the audio equivalent of Blur in a parallax, and there is a lot in Hollow Knight, and it's just wonderful. And even the pizzicatos are phrased. As for the dialogues, they are not fully dubbed. For each sentence of any NPC, there are a few syllables in an imaginary language. The sound effects, onomatopoeia, and screams of the bosses are also provided by human voices, and often mixed with other sounds for a sometimes striking effect. I especially have in mind Soul Master's stagger, when the boss deflates and lets out a scream. Here it sounds like 2 drunk guys. But in the game it sounds like this, which is ever so slightly more fit for a Soul Master. Music helps a lot. However, the playable character, like all the other vessels, and especially the Eponymous character, cannot speak. Hollow Nest itself seems silent since the infection has almost taken possession of it, and some areas are littered with bug corpses. Therefore, Hollow Knight's music must offer a particular dimension, or the more narrative, as the kingdom has lost its voice. And for that it uses various tools. A wide range of tones, the restricted choice of the musical themes, and their strong link to the story thanks to the leitmotif principle, but also a very careful choice of the arpeggios. They are tied to the harmony and therefore linked to the structure of the pieces, to the narration, and I am always attracted by the fact that very often when an arpeggio appears, its pattern finds an origin in the story. There's also meticulous work on arpeggios in Celeste's soundtrack, which I will talk about later on the channel. And this character, who listens without speaking, never seems to lose their composure. They have only eyes for a face, or rather openings on the emptiness that fills them, which never change appearance except when they die. Nor does their face, even in the most spectacular movements like the super dash. And I find that the sound design of the Little Heroes movements also wonderfully translates this contained character, their apparent impassivity. The sounds related to external elements, like the crystal heart or the charge of a nail heart, may be a bit stronger, as well as everything related to soul. But apart from that, the sound effects associated with the character's movements are soft and very brief. The emphasis on combat is also discreetly and elegantly underlined by some of the sounds when the knight parries blows or unsheathes their nail when challenging bosses.